Welcome everyone, and thanks for being with us for today's webinar, The Future of Backup Isn't Backup, brought to you by Zerto. A few reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email in a couple of days with a link to view the webinar on demand. There's also a Q&A widget on your screen. When you enter your question, it will disappear from your side and show up in ours. But don't worry, we have it and we'll answer your questions at the end. If we don't get to your question, we will be able to follow up with you after the presentation today. So let's get started. Our speaker today is Steve Blow. Steve is a technology evangelist at Zerto and has been with their team for 2.5 years. Prior to fulfilling this role, Steve has held multiple other roles in Zerto, supporting customers and partners in improving their resiliency, capabilities, and offerings. Prior to being at Zerto, Steve was a solutions architect at a large UK CSP for 6 years, working primarily with large, high-performance enterprise architectures. So Steve, I will hand it to you to get started.
Thank you very much. My name's Steve Blow, technology evangelist at Zerto. Been here for over 2.5 years now. And I'm here to talk to you about the future of backup not being backup. Really, this is around what's coming in the future for Zerto. As a start, I wanted to talk really about where Zerto has come from, where you may understand Zerto fits, and then move on to what we've got coming in the future and where we can potentially fill a hole in the market that has existed for a long time. So Zerto, when we first released back in 2011, the company was formed in 2009, but the first product release was 2011. It was very much hypervisor-based replication, disaster recovery focused. It's how we were marketed, that's how we entered the space. A lot of change has occurred in the market since then, and a lot of change has occurred in our products since then. We now like to talk about ourselves as being an IT resilience platform. Key element that ties all of that together and how we provide those capabilities is down to our continuous data protection capability. Everything we do ultimately centers around this. It enables numerous use cases, which we'll touch on as we go through this. And then around that, we then wrap orchestration and automation. If you look at traditional tools, you have the replication tool or a protection tool, and then you would need a separate orchestration or automation tool that goes on top of that. Ultimately meaning that in order to deliver the capabilities that Zerto can do, quite often you've needed a multi-point solution. The idea with Zerto is that it's a single pane of glass and it's a single point solution. Simplifying deployment, simplifying management, etc. The orchestration and automation, again, adds a different level of capability to the use cases we can achieve, particularly around mobility. And again, I'll talk a bit about that as we go through. And then lastly, the final piece of the puzzle is that we wrap that with analytics and a level of control. We have a cloud-based analytics platform that gives you visibility on historical data, as well as future sizing capabilities as well. So you have insights around where your environment has grown from, where it's growing to, as well from a projection perspective. So if we start first by looking at the 3 use cases I have highlighted here, or the 3 capabilities. So continuous data protection, what does that look like with Zerto? Journal-based recovery and application consistency groupings. So Zerto is a very simple tool to utilize. It's a very straightforward tool to implement. There's 2 major components in the vast majority of deployments, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But really the key aspect here is that Zerto can be installed in 2 hours and be replicating at the end of that. And that simplicity is at the core of everything we do. There are no hardware components to Zerto. It is software only, and that's part of the reason that it can be implemented so quickly. If we look at the first component, this is the management interface, and we call this the Zerto Virtual Manager, or ZVM. It installs on a Windows server, and it integrates with the Hypervisor Manager. So in VMware, that's vCenter. In Hyper-V, that's System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Zerto supports both VMware and Hyper-V. And once this is installed, you typically would have one on either site for resiliency purposes. We then have the capability to push out within the HTML5 web interface what we call our virtual replication appliances, or VRAs. These are pushed out as OVF files from within the interface, as I say, and they're pushed out to each ESXi host. So it's a single VRA per ESXi host. It's a Debian-based appliance, virtual appliance. And this is really the key to how we scale and the key to why Zerto is considered an enterprise-class product. For every host you have, you deploy a virtual replication appliance where you want to protect workloads to or from. It means as you add hosts to your environment, all you need to do is deploy a virtual replication appliance on the new host. You've instantly scaled your capability. And that scale-out architecture is key to everything that we do. Our VRAs provide compression of any replication before we replicate it over the wire. And you can even throttle the bandwidth for the utilization of Zerto as well. If we look at actually how they then protect the virtual machines, Zerto is obviously plugged in via the virtual replication appliance. So as a VM that you've chosen to protect makes a change to the storage will then acknowledge that back to the VM, at which point it's obviously been written. When Zerto, the VRAs, see that acknowledgement come back through the hypervisor, we take a copy into memory. So there's a couple of key aspects there that are crucial in how we operate and the benefits that we can provide you. And number one is that we're taking that post-write. We're doing that after the acknowledgement. That means we're not adding any latency between your VM and the storage. And the second point is that we're then taking that into memory on the VRA itself, which means we're not adding any I/O onto your production storage either. So Zerto as an overhead on your production environment is literally the VRA itself, of which the default deployment size is 1 vCPU and 3 gig of RAM. So this is minimal amount of resource that you're assigning to this element. It's got therefore a minimal overhead on your production environment. That again is a really key, unique selling point of Zerto. Traditionally, you have tools that utilize snapshots or have agents installed in your VMs. Using those methods ultimately adds an overhead to your production environment one way or another. What we're really looking to do here is remove that overhead. You don't need to scale up your production environment just to implement a protection capability. And Zerto is one of the tools that you can enable you to realize that. What we're then doing is we're replicating all of those changes over to the target side and storing them in a journal. And they were maintained in the journal for the journal history period that you've defined. That can be a minimum of 1 hour, maximum of 30 days today. And then once the change reaches that journal history period, so if you had a journal history period of 30 days, for example, once that change that occurred 30 days earlier, it's then promoted to the replica disk. And obviously something new is then entering in the journal at the beginning. What we then give you the capability within the journal to do is actually recover to lots of different points in time. So within this journal, we obviously have the history period that you've defined, all of the changes that have occurred during that period, and we're inserting checkpoints every 5 seconds within there. And these are points in time that you can recover to. They're obviously inserted on the target side. They're not anything like a snapshot. They're just a marker in the journal. And it gives you the ability to recover from seconds before whatever the issue is. If you look historically, it may be a synchronous protection tool or something like that. That's great for physical failures, but your RPO drastically changes when you have a logical failure because you're going back to a backup or a snapshot or something like that. And therefore, that's going to have been taken less frequently, and you're going to go back to a further back point in time. I guess the key thing here with Zerto is that you can always recover to seconds before the issue occurred. So regardless what the issue is with Zerto, you can recover to seconds before that issue occurred. And that's really powerful and something that I'm going to talk a bit more about as we go through. The next point to note here is that Zerto gives you more protection than just protecting each VM individually. Again, if you look at historical products, when you're setting up your protection, you're protecting each VM individually. That's great. But ultimately, it means each VM is protected to a different point in time. When you come to recover your VMs, you've probably got VMs that are making up an application. There's lots of dependencies in there. So you've recovered all of these VM dependencies, these workload dependencies, but ultimately you've recovered them all to different points in time. So even after you've recovered the VMs and your application, you've actually got to fight to get them all back into sync so the application's actually usable. What Zerto actually allows you to do is group your virtual protection groups based on dependencies. We call this virtual protection groups. If you group your virtual machines within a virtual protection group, what we're doing is when we're inserting that checkpoint in the journal on the target side, we're inserting that checkpoint at the exact same point in time across all of the VMs within that virtual protection group. What that means is when you then come to recover, you recover the entire virtual protection group, all of the VMs within it, to the exact same point in time. Effectively, this allows you to recover your entire application to a consistent point in time. So that whole step, which quite often that step could have taken longer than the recovery itself, getting everything back into sync, that whole step is removed. And with Zerto, we allow you to recover the whole application to a single point in time so that you don't have to get everything back into sync. It's recovered in sync. And that really is, again, a key unique selling point of Zerto and why people utilize Zerto, because it's about delivering not only low RPOs, but also low recovery times as well. And if you're removing steps that have to be performed on recovery, you're reducing that recovery time even further. So now if we have a look at long-term retention, this is something that we're working on. It's something that's coming in our 7 release next year. We have some capabilities around this, but it's something that we're going to add further capability, as I said, in our 7 release next year. And again, if we have a look at how you deal with scenarios today, traditionally with backup, if we take ransomware as a use case here, ransomware occurs, it infects your server, it encrypts your files. Traditionally today, to recover from that, you're going back to a backup. As we know, backups are typically scheduled, and you're therefore going back to whenever the last backup occurred. You could have data loss of hours, potentially even days, let alone then the recovery time associated with that. And that really doesn't fit the model of today's marketplace. Now, if we have a look at what's going on in the market, digital transformation is a key message and a key initiative of a lot of businesses. The reason for that is the flexibility it provides, the speed it provides, and ultimately the resiliency it provides. What not necessarily has changed alongside that is backup. You still back up on your production site, you still schedule it. These requirements and ultimately the threats that are facing us in the world today, from the likes of ransomware, but even against things like corruption, anything like that as well, they are demanding that there's a change to how we envisage and how we protect our environments. Customers want continuous availability, and rightly so. What Zerto allows you to do is in the same scenario, instead of having to go back to a backup that occurred hours before, you can go back to the checkpoint that occurred 5 seconds before and recover your environment with minimal data loss in minimal amounts of time. And this is a really powerful capability for businesses. And just to emphasize this point, we've got a use case here. We have a customer, TenCate. They had a ransomware attack. And ultimately, there's a difference between what they did do historically when they've had an infection before and what they did do when they had Zerto implemented, and ultimately what the outcomes were. So if we have a look at this, traditionally and in the past, they were using backup to tape and to disk. They had a file server infected, the entire file server at a manufacturing facility. They lost 12 hours worth of data. It's a fairly significant amount of data. And it took them 2 weeks to actually recover and be up and running completely. They then obviously implemented Zerto after that incident, and effectively this enabled them to have the continuous replication and journaling capability that Zerto had. So they then had another scenario. It was a ransomware attack, and a number of directories on a file server at a manufacturing facility again were impacted. And instead of taking that 12 hours, or rather losing the 12 hours worth of data, they lost just 10 seconds worth of data. It's a big difference there. And rather than taking 2 weeks to recover, they'd had everything recovered in under 10 minutes. If you look at scenarios that occur in the marketplace and ultimately in the news today, not only is these sorts of impacts having a financial impact on business through data loss, etc., but there's a brand damage impact as well, which has its own financial implications. There's been lots of scenarios where they've been highly publicized and it damages the brand. Ultimately, if you've got a solution where you can recover with minimal impact to your end customers, your end users, it's not going to make it into the news, and that whole brand damage can be something that you mitigate because you're able to recover before that becomes an issue. And really, that's what we're seeing as a trend in the marketplace. People are wanting continuous journal-based protection, and that really is the future. That's what we can deliver. That's what we're aiming to deliver going forward. And ultimately, as I said, this enables customers to minimize their data loss scenarios and provide that continuous availability that they strive for. I guess the next point to raise here is that, that's all very well talking about backup, but there's disaster recovery use cases here as well. And then ultimately, everyone's talking about hybrid cloud strategy, which is great, but how do you provide the mobility that actually enables a true hybrid cloud strategy, rather than just placing workloads on the best fit requirement and platform based on their day one requirements? How do you ensure that you can actually move those workloads around post scenario or post day one when those scenarios and requirements change? Ultimately, what we're therefore seeing is that rather than have 3 separate products to deliver these solutions, we're seeing the market actually want these solutions to be brought together and implemented under a single platform. And that is what Zerto and our IT resilience platform is able to deliver. It's a backup, disaster recovery, and cloud mobility solution, enabling you to converge all of these products. This would have been a multi-point solution traditionally in the past into a single point solution. It makes management a lot easier. You don't have to have skills in various different products. It makes an overhead a lot easier because you've got a single product rather than 3 different products potentially impacting each other. And it ultimately makes the cost a lot cheaper because you're buying one product. You're not buying 3 separate solutions here. And as I said, Zerto gives you the capability to recover your entire site, your entire applications through our virtual protection groups, and also individual virtual machines, as well as the files within them. That's a really powerful use case, and ultimately enables that whole IT resilience platform, the ability and granularity that Zerto provides, not just from points in time, but also what we're able to recover, enables us to provide and ultimately merge those 3 traditionally unique use cases into a single platform. So what this delivers is seconds of RPO at scale. Ultimately, if you look at the scenarios that we're now faced with in the world, whether it's ransomware, whether it's anything else, another malware attack, whether it's corruption, ultimately business want their applications to be available continuously and not have these long outages that traditionally have been associated with any issue where you're going back to a backup, as well as obviously having that minimal data loss. And that's really where this RPO of seconds comes in. And you've seen the ability of Zerto to scale through our scale-out architecture that I talked about earlier. And when you combine that into the whole 3 use case scenarios there, disaster recovery, backup, and cloud mobility, that's a really powerful capability. Which really brings me on to what we're bringing in the future. And this is the long-term retention piece that I keep talking about. Zerto is looking to provide what we're terming as an elastic journal capability. Right now, Zerto can deliver you 30 days journal history on disk, but that's great for the vast majority of recovery scenarios. And if we look at that, 86% of recoveries are done from those short-term retention scenarios. But actually, there's a long-term retention requirement for compliancy reasons, for auditing purposes, whatever it might be. And that has been something that you're reliant solely on your backups. There's an overhead on your backup, on your production environment from taking the backups today. Really, this is about how can Zerto help that? How can Zerto remove that overhead and still provide that granularity that you need and ultimately the history that you require to meet your compliance? And so we have obviously the short-term element, as I said, up to 30 days covered today, stored on production-grade storage. It means that recovery is quick. Your RPO is just seconds. Zerto actually supports one-to-many, so you can replicate to multiple locations. That includes having a local copy of the journal, as well as a remote copy of the journal, so that you can recover locally in the event of a logical failure, or recover remotely in the event of a physical failure where you need to go to a new location. But the challenge has always been that with long-term retention, people don't want to pay for production-grade storage for long-term retention. As you can see, there are many scenarios where you need to actually recover from these elements. Just 14% of recoveries are done from long-term retention, but ultimately it needs to exist. It doesn't necessarily need to have the same recovery times, and that's why you can utilize cheaper storage here. So Zerto is going to be enabling cost-effective secondary storage here. We're going to support the likes of NFS, SMB, S3, HPE Store Once, there's going to be some integration into, and then obviously your native Azure and AWS integration as well. Rather than take full copies every time when you're shipping this off to site, we have that journal, we have the checkpoints in there. We're able to take synthetic full copies, essentially incremental backups off-site, meaning that your overhead on storage is lower. So if we have a look today, I've talked about how we operate, and we have the source and target environment. As I said, this target can actually be in the same site if need be. It can be on the same platform, so you can be replicating within the source environment. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're creating a journal with our checkpoints within there. What we're then looking to enable with this new capability is the ability to take points in time from within that journal, off-site to a repository in any of the locations I've mentioned, and ultimately store them for longer term retention for those compliancy use cases, for those auditing use cases, and ultimately providing you peace of mind that you've got that capability. The key aspect here is that when we're doing this on the target side. I talked a lot about historically and traditionally, backups are done on the source environment. They're involving snapshots or agents in your VMs, and there's an overhead on your production environment because of that. You see spikes, you have to manage your timescales, when they're running, when do they complete, how do you minimize the impact on your end users, your end customers. Managing that can be quite a big challenge. What Zerto's doing here is removing that from the source site and doing it all on the target side. We don't do anything different to how we operate today on the source side. So everything I talked about Zerto being next to no impact on your production environment beyond the VRAs itself, it exists today and will exist in the future, even when utilizing the long-term retention elements. So what this actually looks like is essentially what I showed you earlier. We still have our source environment and we still have a target environment. This target can be located on the same source environment if required. So if you want to utilize the same source environment as your local journal, you can do that. What doesn't change is our impact on production. Zerto has next to no impact on the production environment, and that's through obviously the mechanisms that I discussed earlier. The only impact is the VRA itself. And what we can then do is once the journal is populated, we've got checkpoints being created in the journal on the target side. We can actually take those checkpoints. Once they're created, as I said, over on the target side, we can then take them, ship them to the repository. So these are points in time within the journal. You're taking them off-site into longer-term retention, whether it's S3, whatever you choose as your repository there, and storing them to meet your long-term retention requirements and your compliancy requirements. Again, key aspect here, traditionally, this would be performed on the production side. There'd be a production overhead to perform this. Zerto and our ability to have minimal impact on your production environment is going to be moving this so that you can do it on your target side. and ultimately remove that overhead that traditionally exists at the source side. What this looks like is obviously on the target side, we have a journal, we have a target disk, which is where the journal is promoted to once it hits the journal history period. So what we can do is within the journal, we obviously have those points in time. We know exactly what the changes have occurred between each checkpoint and between the last checkpoint that we've taken. And we therefore can read the bitmap and only send the change blocks since you last took a point in time off to the repository. And write that to S3, an SMB share, an NFS share, wherever you choose as a target, and ultimately store it for the retention period that you define. Likewise, what we then enable you to do is recover your data from any of those long-term retention points in time. So you can implement this from within the ZVM. Our DSS element, which is installed and running on the virtual replication appliance itself. So the same scale-out architecture that exists around the virtual replication appliance still exists here as well. We pull the data out of the repository, and then the VRA is able to restore a disk based on this data, and the ZVM will then attach that to a VM, and ultimately you've then recovered your data from the point in time that you've chosen offsite. On top of this, we're then adding intelligent indexing and search capability. So this is going to give you the ability to search for individual files. You can see when it was last modified and things like that. And this is going to be the key mechanism for how you recover. You can then recover directly from within the Zerto interface and these searches, utilizing the indexing that we're going to be provided. And you recover that into a cloud platform or into your on-premises platform, wherever you ultimately require from a source perspective. And again, this isn't just about utilizing this just for the long-term retention. This capability is going to exist for the short and long-term retention use cases. So effectively, a user needs to recover a file for whatever reason. Maybe it's ransomware, maybe a user deleted it. Historically, for example, if a user's deleted a file, but it was only created that day, chances are it doesn't even exist in your backup. Again, that's a key element as to where Zerto's continuous data protection provides additional value and granularity. So a user needs to recover a file for whatever reason. They can search for that file within the interface. We get a result across all targets. As I said, you can be replicating your workloads to more than one location. So you might have different histories available on different sites, different targets. You can choose which point in time you want to recover to. We then perform the recovery orchestration using the mechanisms I talked previously, if it's from the long-term retention element, or the elements, the mechanism that I talked at the beginning, if it's from the short-term journal, the local journals. And ultimately, the file is then recovered and made available. It's simple and it's fast. No impact on your production environment, and you get a far greater level of granularity. Key thing is you can choose to take those off-site longer-term retention points in time much more frequently because there's no impact on production, and that's traditionally been the limiting factor. So we're looking to add, as I said, this elastic journal capability. That's that long-term retention piece. It allows you to take your journal to beyond the 30 days and have historical data for your long-term compliancy requirements. We're adding the intelligent indexing and search capabilities. We're obviously adding intelligent data protection workflows around this. When do you want to take these off-site, how often, etc. Obviously, the architecture remains. That scale-out architecture will absolutely remain. And we're adding various target repositories. I talked about these, so around S3, SMB, NFS, all of the usual suspects here, as well as your public cloud environments as well, so Azure, AWS, and integration into HPE Store once. And to touch back on this, all of this enables you to have a single platform, an IT resilience platform, to deliver you backup, to deliver you disaster recovery, and to deliver you cloud mobility. And again, that's all under one single platform. And we'll all be here with Zerto 7 during Q1 2019. So thank you. That's Zerto, and really what we're looking to bring from a IT resilience platform perspective, what we're looking to add from a backup perspective, what traditionally has been known as backup, and the capabilities that we're looking to deliver there.
Okay, so let's take a few questions that we've received from the audience. This first one is, how do you provide the capability to recover individual files?
It's a great question. So Zerto gives you that capability by effectively allowing you to choose any VM that's currently being protected. You can then browse the journal, choose any point in time within the journal. And what we'll do is then give you the ability to choose any disk on that VM. We'll then mount that disk from the point in time you've chosen on the recovery virtual replication appliance, and then give you the ability to browse that via the ZVM interface and download and restore that.
Okay, this next one is, do you have a supported list of OS or applications?
That's a great question. So I guess the key thing to note here is that Zerto is block level replication. We therefore are largely not reliant on any of the OSs or applications or anything that's running on your VM, because we're replicating it at the block level. It means that our capability to replicate a wider range of applications and OSs is very much apparent there. So there isn't a requirement from that perspective, particularly around a backup use case, because we can recover the data from a block level. I guess the only scenario that you should factor in there is that we support the disk format from a file recovery perspective.
Okay, this next one is there an additional module required to utilize this feature?
No, again, exactly really what Zerto is intending here. Simplicity is key to everything we do. So you don't need to deploy anything additional. There's no additional component that needs to be installed. We're utilizing the exact same methodology, so the ZVMs and the VRAs, to perform all of this functionality.
All right, I think we have one more here to take. This one is, which public cloud platforms do you support protection into and out of?
Again, great question. So Zerto supports AWS and Azure today, and we can replicate into and out of those platforms. From an on-premise perspective, we support VMware and Hyper-V that I mentioned earlier. And the key thing is that Zerto supports replication between these as well. We perform the conversion on the fly, and that's really how we enable that cloud mobility piece.
Okay, well, that's about our time for questions. I'd like to thank you, Steve, and Zerto for creating this content and sponsoring this great webinar. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. We will see you next time for another Zerto webinar. Take care.
Thanks, guys.